Welcome to our ongoing series of virtual book signing events. On behalf of everyone at the Hotchkiss Library of Sharon, I am very pleased to welcome you all here. Just a reminder that we ask you to stay muted during Brian and Ira's conversation, and you may direct your questions in the chat box to me, and we will pose your questions later in the program. We have copies of Ticking Clock available for your purchase. They come with a signed book plate, so please let us know in the chat box if you're interested, or call us or email us tomorrow at the library. I'll just mention briefly that growing up in my house in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Sundays between 7 and 8 p.m. were sacred. That hour was reserved for watching 60 Minutes. And when I grew up and left home, I knew soon never to call my father during that hour. I did once, and he said, "You should know better after all those years here, that you should not disturb me between 7 and 8 o'clock unless it was extremely important." So I imagine it might have been the same for many of you in your homes, and maybe still is. So it is my special honor to welcome Ira Rosen this evening. Ira is the winner of 24 National Emmys, 4 DuPont Awards, 2 RFK Awards, and 2 Peabodys for his work. He worked at 60 Minutes for almost 25 years. A former Nieman Fellow at Harvard University, Rosen was also senior producer of Primetime Live with Diane Sawyer. Ira will be joined in conversation this evening with Sharon's own Brian Ross, a longtime investigative journalist, now with the Law and Crime Network. Brian is also a member of the board of directors of the Hotchkiss Library and serves as our treasurer. So thank you both so much for joining us tonight to discuss Ira's new book, Ticking Clock, Behind the Scenes at 60 Minutes.
Thank you for having me.
So glad
Thank
you're
you.
here.
And Gretchen, thank you. And thanks to Holly Nelson for continuing to put together these great programs that have kept us going through our lockdown. We're getting close to ending it. And soon we hope to have authors like Ira and others appear in person back in our beautiful library. And as you notice on our website today, we've announced plans for our new expansion with a refurbishment of the great historic interior. It's going to be fantastic. But first, let's get to Ira Rosen, my good friend, longtime colleague. We worked together at ABC News for many, many years. We've shared many a drink, many a screening room, many a production meeting with cantankerous executive producers. Ira, thank you so much. It's a fascinating book. It's a great read. Let me start by asking you, everybody in journalism, and the broadcast journalism certainly, wants to work at 60 Minutes. How did you get a job there?
So I was working at WOR TV in Channel 9, and I had done a story about how easy it was to get a hold of military secrets. And I posed as a government contractor, and sure as hell, they sent me secret films in the mail. And I ended up doing the story, and the night it aired, the projectionist at 60 Minutes was having a fight with his wife. Normally never watches TV. He saw the story. The next day, he was on the coffee line with the creator of 60 Minutes, Don Hewitt. And he said to Don, "Hey, Don, I saw a story. It was just like the stuff that we used to do." And Don said, "What the hell do you mean used to do?" So Don tracked me down and called me up at my parents' home where I was living at the time. And my mother answered. And he said, "Hi, I'm Don Hewitt." And my mother says, "Oh, you have a lovely wife." And he said, "Thank you very much. Is Ira Rosen around? I'd like to offer him a job. Thank you very much. He's really not interested. He's got a job already. Thank you for calling." And she hangs up on him. And I said, "Who is that?" "Don Hewitt of 60 Minutes. He wanted to offer you a job, and you already have one. How many jobs do you need?" So I quickly called Don back. Don said, "Hey, kid, I don't know about you, but I like your mother. So if you don't want the job, tell her it's hers." Needless to say, I wanted the job. So the next day I went into 60 Minutes. And you got to remember, I was 26 years old. At that point in time, as I wrote in the book, I'd been fired from a bunch of newspaper jobs. I was bouncing around. It was a period after Watergate when everybody wanted to be the next investigative reporter. And it was really, really hard to get a spot. And Don never looked at my resume. He always operated out of a sense of touch. He felt if he liked you, he could tell just by the interactions. And he said, "Well, it doesn't matter if I like you, he has to like you." And the he was Mike Wallace. And so he walked me down the hall, and I went into Mike's office, And Mike was completely unimpressed with my resume, completely unimpressed with my experience. And he said, how much TV time have you had? And I said, 6 months, inflating it by about 2. And he said, that's not very much to be a producer on 60 Minutes. And he said, I know what I can do for you. What can you do for me? And it was a great question, one I didn't have a really good answer for. So I noticed he had a tennis ball in the corner of his office. And he said, and I said to him, do you play tennis? And he said, what's it to you? And I said, well, I was on the Cornell tennis team. And he told me later that he gave me the job because he figured he'd get 6 months of tennis out of me before firing me. So I called, after I got the job, I called my mom really excited. And I said, hey, Mom, I was just hired to be Mike Wallace's producer on 60 Minutes. I'm the youngest producer in the history of the show. And without missing a beat, my dear Jewish mother said, why can't you work for Dan Rather?
That's a great story, Ira. So you went on for more than 2 decades with Mike Wallace, for better or worse. It was like a marriage. That relationship between producer and correspondent is like a marriage. And there's a dominant person and there's a person who's not. You both were dominant personalities. How did that work out?
It didn't work out well at first. Brian, one of the great successes, and I'm going to give it away, is that in your career, you've always valued the work of producers, and you always valued it as a great partnership. And Brian had a producer who knew well in Washington, Ira Silverman, for a period of time. And then now he has Rhonda Schwartz, who's also a fabulous producer. And Brian has always valued that relationship. Well, at 60 Minutes, they valued it up to a point, but they also felt very guilty about the fact that the producer often finds the stories, comes up with the subjects for it, has to do the research, and they feel less like a journalist. So Mike would always be struggling with the relationship. And what he used to do is he used to play off producers against producers. So he would say to me, hey, Lowell Bergman has a great story. He's got Meyer Lansky lined up. It turned out he had Meyer Lansky's mother, not quite Meyer Lansky. And then he'd say the same to Lowell about me. He'd say, hey, Ira's got, so-and-so, and get him all riled up. So they pitted us against each other. And the correspondents were pitted against each other. Mike would steal a story from Morley, and then Morley wouldn't talk to Mike for a year, even though their offices were this far apart. And so it was a struggle. I mean, I was on one hand learning from the Picasso of interviewers, which was Mike Wallace. But on the other hand, I also was being fairly regularly abused by the man. I was being yelled at. I was being called names. If a story wasn't working out right, he threatened to fire me on the spot. And every year, it wasn't just an idle threat. He would fire a producer every year. It was kind of like what Goldman Sachs does, where they fire the bottom 10% every year. And they would do that at 60 Minutes too. Either fire you or transfer you to another correspondent.
So it was cutthroat for sure. Sounds like you could also get an ulcer or two out of that.
Well, in fact, there was a producer, and I'll mention his name now since he's gone public and said, I'm the one who had it. Harry Moses was a longtime producer, and he developed an ulcer that he nicknamed Myrick, which was Mike Wallace's real name. And a lot of people had ailments that they developed. I had a bad back for nearly a decade, to the point where on my honeymoon I had to sleep on the floor. My back was in such pain from working with Wallace.
Harry, of course, is one of our neighbors up here in Litchfield County, a great producer in his own right. But
sure.
Give people listening today an idea. You really did. You do the writing, you do the prep, you'd get the people to do the interview. I mean, it was almost like a failure of truth in advertising to call it Mike Wallace doing everything. You did
Right.
at least half, if not more.
Well, just to be on his side for 1 second, he was doing 20, 25 pieces a year, and he had about 5 producers, and then maybe 1 or 2 visitors. And so he couldn't do all the research, obviously, himself. He had to depend on the producers to do it. But on the other hand, he felt very guilty about the fact that he would literally be parachuting into a story after you've done the research. And when you do a story with Mike, you had to have a secret document. or a secret fact that he would reveal in the course of an interview. And when the guy would go down, and one of my early stories I did was on the Niagara River sewer treatment plant. And it wasn't working. What they were doing is the effluent was going in and then it was going right back out into the river. And so we confronted the guy who ran the sewer treatment plant and said, hey, everything was A-OK. Well, I had been given by somebody at the sewer treatment plant a document the day before that showed that the sewer treatment plant was broken. So in the course of the interview, Mike took the document out and says, you're saying your plant works, everything is going okay, the sewage is being removed, yes, yes, yes. Well, here's a document that shows exactly what is not working, which is your entire plant is a failure. And the guy does like this. I have that document somewhere here on my desk too. It was a clean kill. And that's what you always try to get with a Mike Wallace interview. He always wanted that gotcha moment. And as producers, you worked sometimes for months to come up with that document or the secret information that will contradict kind of a storyline that the person who you're interviewing has developed.
You know, producers like you and Rhonda Schwartz, I think, is listening in tonight. You work for people who have a reputation for asking hard questions, embarrassing people. Why would anybody actually want to be interviewed by Mike Wallace?
Right, and I write about this in the book. So the first thing is people think they could outsmart him. Two is they think they have no other choice in some ways, but they need to get their story out, because if they don't get their story out, the other side or the people who are against them will be able to dominate the broadcast. So they feel that at least they'll get their position out. And the other sense is they feel that they're in the right, even if they're in the wrong. So they feel like, like when it wasn't a Mike Wallace story, when we were doing stories about the opiate epidemic. And the companies felt is, pain is a real issue in America, and we're providing relief for many, many people who suffer pain. And this was sort of their line. We made sure that we reflected that, but we also, in the story, revealed how they're just flooding the marketplace with painkillers. And there was very little supervision involved in this stuff. So, if you tell a person, tell me what the main point you want to make is. And the main point, say in the opiate business, was we're helping a lot of people who are suffering from pain and we're solving their issues. Done. We'll put that in. So then they'll agree to go on camera and they'll tell that story.
Was there a point after one particularly terrific story of all the so many you did that you thought, all right, I'm safe here. I'm landed. I'm planted?
Not really.
Oh, really?
Yeah, no, you always play scared. You always play, what I remember when I won, a big award, which you know about it, which is the DuPont Award. So I won the award and Mike said, well, this will give you a weekend pass. Meaning he'll give me 2 days off for good behavior. And then right after you get back, it's okay, what do you got for me now? You're a total failure. And so it didn't matter that you're doing, it didn't matter. Like in the book, I talk about, one time we won a Emmy Award for an interview we did with Edward Teller. And Mike's reaction was F you, at the end of it. So, they never let you get too big in the bridges. An Emmy Award probably bought you maybe a day. DuPont got a couple of days out of it. Peabody, you could ride that for a week. But you never felt safe in the job.
That's why this book is so amazing, because it seems like the dream job. A producer at 60 Minutes with essentially an unlimited budget, the biggest news audience in America, everyone like Gretchen's father watching Sunday night religiously, and yet inside there, huge turmoil and ulcers, etc.
No, you're exactly right. And people don't understand that sometimes when you're living your dream, it could also be a nightmare at other times during the process, because you are, like I wrote in the book, it's like being Superman. Because you're righting the wrongs of society. You got this extraordinary powers to get the wrongfully convicted out of jail, to turn bad government policy into positive stuff. I did one story at 60 Minutes about insider trading in Congress. And it wasn't with Mike, it was with Steve Kropp. And we did the story in November, and by March, it had passed Congress, the Senate, and President Obama was signing it into law. And I was invited to be part of the signing because I had done the story. So I was sitting literally, a few feet away from the president and VP Biden at the time as they signed this into law. So that's the type of significance that 60 Minutes could really do. If it had appeared on Channel 9, where I used to work, I think it would have been forgotten, and the legislation would never have gotten anywhere. But it's because of the audience and because of people being religious about it. And the thing about being on 60 Minutes, which I always remembered, was when you're on, let's say you're going to Washington on the shuttle the next day, and you're getting on the airplane, people are talking about the show the night before. In the old days, they were more than maybe today, but they talked about what they saw, what an amazing story it was. And you could hear the buzz on an airplane, and that was pretty cool.
Absolutely. And certainly your calls are returning when you say Ira Rosen, 60 Minutes, Ira Rosen from WR, maybe less so, I suppose.
Totally.
Was there ever a story that blew up on you?
Well, when you say blew up, I mean, probably the story that had the most legal consequence was Food Lion. We had done a story, for the people who don't know, this is more not at 60 Minutes, but at ABC. And we had, at that point in time, in 1989 to 94, had pioneered the use of hidden cameras. And we were doing a lot of amazing, amazing stories, bringing it into VA homes and board and care homes and meat packing plants and mental retardation centers. And we also brought it into a grocery store chain to show the food handling process of it. And when we did the story, Food Lion said, if you broadcast the hidden camera that you shot in our stores, we will sue you. And we had the entire legal corporate structure of ABC at the time, and I think it was Disney as well, descend onto our floor, and they knew what was at stake. And we broadcast the story, and as I document in the book, we were sued, and we lost the first round, not because we did any libelous work, but because they claimed we violated a North Carolina tort about competition and not being able to send in competing people to see and spy on and things like that. And then we won it on appeal. But after that story aired, the uses of hidden camera pretty much disappeared. It was done in a very, very sparing way. And it really changed investigative reporting, I think, and not necessarily for the better. ABC at that point reduced their insurance. They have a deductible. They increased their deductible. So by increasing their deductible, they also decreased the amount of risk they wanted to take. So as you know, Brian, because you were there during the period of time, it got a lot harder. The scrutiny got tougher. There were more lawyers involved. And that Food Lion litigation story, it actually was a final question on a bar exam, changed things, not necessarily for the better.
There are huge costs, of course, in defending such suits, but as I recall in Food Lion, it was a gigantic judgment. Just how much was it again, Ira?
Well, the first go round,
it was $1, wasn't it?
The final round was $1. Yeah, it was $1 in the end. But it didn't matter because Food Lion had won the first go round, and they publicized it and made it seem like a big deal. And I have to say, and I wrote about this in the book, ABC made all the wrong decisions. They decided to hire a local counsel because they felt the local counsel would appeal to a North Carolina jury. Bad mistake. Instead of hiring experienced libel attorneys and media attorneys, which they ended up doing later on. They didn't want me and Rick Kaplan, who was the executive producer, to be present in North Carolina, even though we were named defendants, because they said, oh, you guys are Jewish and it may not play well in North Carolina. So they decided not to have us there. And they like the fact that they'll have Diane Sawyer testify on our behalf because she's from Kentucky, and that would appeal to a Southern jury. It was the stupidest thinking in the world. They treated the jury there as a bunch of idiots. And then in the end, by the way, the jury never got to see the broadcast. The judge said, for the sake of this litigation, assume everything in the broadcast to be true. And again, that was something that should have been appealed. They should have stopped the trial immediately. A good lawyer would have appealed that. And then they said, and then the jury, of course, at the end said, had we seen the piece, we wouldn't have given Food Lion a broken nickel. So it changed so much of what happened after that. And a lot of it had to do with just, stupid planning on the part of ABC at the time.
Not well managed, not at all. Just a reminder to everyone watching, send in your questions. You have some for Ira that I'm not going to ask. Please do. He wants to take any and all questions. Ira, in your book, you are very honest, I think, all truth-telling about the personalities of many of the best-known people we see on television every night. What's been the reaction to that?
Some of them, I don't want to get into particular this name and that name,
right?
But a lot, a couple in particular, objected to it. It's okay. Some of these people have their own PR teams, and so they want, only the positives to come out. But as a friend of ours said to me, you were an umpire, and you called it balls and strikes. And by the way, I said positive things about some of the people who I maybe said less than positive things about. I just had to tell the story honestly and the way I saw it, and the good and the bad about some of the individuals. And by the way, I wasn't telling anything about them causing any mass murder or anything. In some cases, I was just talking about their personalities and the way they interfaced with people. And they don't like anything negative. They have this image and they want it, to be sacrosanct. But right, of course, they have no problem when they're doing stories about other people to tell a more fulsome profile of these people.
Our tough guy colleagues can have some very thin skin, it seems.
Very thin skin. You got it.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about John Gotti Jr. and how you came to forge a relationship with the guy who ran the Gambino Mafia family. Yeah, and you got him on television. That's the big thing.
Yeah, and it took me 4 years. I mean, people think, you make a phone call and they say, oh yeah, what time do you need me to be there by? I went down, I started going down to the courthouse in Lower Manhattan, and I saw John the first time. And as John, by the way, was the master of ceremonies at my retirement party at the Harvard Club. And so he stood up, and the way he told the story is, this guy starts winking at me, and he turns to his attorney, Charlie Carnesi, and he said, who's that guy winking at me? And he said, oh, that's the 60 Minutes producer. And he said, listen, I haven't been in jail so long that a guy's going to make a pass at me. And besides, I ain't doing no interview with a 60 Minutes guy. And then he said, Ira started courting me like a bride. And so I started to go out to Long Island and have dinners with him and visit with him. And I go to a Sunday barbecue. And it just took years. And we'd get close. And then suddenly a bad story would appear in the newspapers about John. And he'd pull it back and and change his mind. And it was finally over a dinner. I'm having dinner in Syosset with John and Charlie Carnesi, his late attorney, and another attorney. And the other attorney is not saying a word. He just said one word, flounder, which is what he ordered for dinner. And Charlie and I are having a good time, and John's telling me about his family and his kids. And at the end of the dinner, this attorney, Tony, comes up to me and he said, okay, you're in. When do you want to do this? And I said, I didn't hear him say anything. He said, when he started talking about his family, that was the code for, let's proceed. And, he had his quote unquote consigliere arrange this thing. And, and this is sort of the struggle about doing this. And we finally have him do it. And Steve Croft, who was the correspondent on the piece, overslept. And all he had to do was come down the stairs, enter a limousine, and take the limousine out to Long Island. And it was 4 years of work that we almost blew. And so while we're standing there, John is saying, I'm not sure if I want to do this. I'm getting calls from the street people who are telling me not to do this. And besides, it's the ultimate sign of disrespect to show up late for a mob boss. The last person who did that with John Gotti, his father, ended up dead. So, finally, Croft shows up and John couldn't help himself. And he says, hey, what happened? Your car run out of gas? And so we finally proceeded to do the interview, but it took quite a long time.
Let me ask you about one you didn't get successfully, Marlon Brando.
So, after I had done a profile of Joe Bonanno, and as part of the profile, I wanted to use some of the Godfather film. And normally you just call the movie studio and they give you approval. Out of the blue, Brando calls me and we begin, he wanted to know if Joe Bonanno was okay with the use of the film and all this stuff. And I assured him he was. And we began a long relationship over the phone. And he was born on the same day I was born, April 3rd. And he would say, I'd call him up and wish him happy birthday. And he'd say, what is it with birthdays? Trees don't celebrate birthdays. Animals don't celebrate birthdays. Why do we have to celebrate birthdays? I said, Marlon, I'm just calling you up to wish you happy birthday. So after a while, I got him to agree to have dinner with Mike Wallace and I. And it was at the Beverly Hills Hotel. He picks us up. And we're driving down Mulholland. And Marlon's driving a Rolls Royce. And Mike's in the front and I'm in the back. And Marlon's running every single red light on Mulholland Drive. And I said, Marlon, what are you doing? You're going to get us killed. He said, you're a man. You're going to let a machine tell you what to do? I don't let a machine tell you what to do. I'm a man. I do what I want. So finally, we got to this restaurant. And Marlon says to Mike Wallace, you're a great actor. And he said, I'm not an actor. I'm a journalist. So he said, oh, stop it. The raised eyebrow, the taking the glasses off, the look of astonishment. I've studied you. You're a master. And Mike was feeling a little uncomfortable, so he changed the subject and he said, how did you get so fat? And Brando says, well, I go to Baskin and Robbins and I can't decide what flavor ice cream I want. So I order a quart of everything they have and I bring it home and I eat it all. At which point Mike sort of said, Marlon, I'm 67 years old. I don't need to make my reputation by showing America what an asshole you are. Why don't we just be friends? And I go crazy because it took months to set this up. Anyway, months later, Brando and I stopped talking for a long period of time, but we had one final conversation. And he asked me, he said, do you play the stock market? And I said, a little bit. I don't have much money. He said, well, let me give you a tip. I said, what's that? Buy the stock. I said, what's the name of it? Apple. And I said, I never heard of it. He said, you will. Trust me. So I go back and I tell Wallace about the conversation. And Mike said, you're going to buy the stock. And I said, why would I take a stock tip from a guy who can't decide what flavor ice cream he wants? So needless to say, those are two that got away.
Well, it's quite a bookend. The movie Godfather got away, but the real Godfather, you got to sit down on 60 Minutes. Is there one story in the end? It's hard to say your favorite child. One story in the end that you're most proud of about?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the opiate epidemic series that I did in collaboration with the Washington Post. And it was something where everything worked out perfectly. We had Bill Whitaker, who's an incredible correspondent, studies, is a great interviewer. We had a great whistleblower, this guy, Joe Renazizi, who was a high-level DEA official. The two Washington Post reporters brought different talents to the table. One had an encyclopedic memory of information. And the other one was Scott Hyam was a dogged reporter who brought us Joe Renazizi. And my associate producer, Sam Hornblower, thought nothing about spending weeks in a West Virginia courthouse going through documents and finding these great things. I mean, that's what brought him joy in life. And I brought the storytelling to the table of how to unfold this extraordinary saga. And everything worked right. The Washington Post printed 20,000 words, banner headline on a Sunday. We broadcast it on a Sunday. And basically, the first story talked about how Congressman Marino of Pennsylvania neutered the DEA's powers to enforce laws against the opiate industry. And he had, and at the very end, the last line of the story was, and he was just named to be Donald Trump's new drug czar. And people literally, you could almost hear the gasping in the planet at that moment in time. 2 days later, Trump rescinds the offer and changes his mind and basically tells Marino he doesn't have a job. So that story we were also allowed to do great follow-ups. And we had a great executive producer, Jeff Fager, who championed the broadcast and pushed us to do more and more stories. We had Marty Barron of the Washington Post, who wanted more and more, and everything worked out perfectly on it. So it's the one I'm probably proudest of.
And you should be. It's one that, of course, I would have great envy about. Just an amazing bit of reporting. And I think in many ways, the 40 minutes on 60 Minutes had far more impact than the banner headlines of the Washington Post.
It did. In fact, one of the wives of the reporters said to him after watching the 60 Minutes piece, "Now I finally understand what your story's about."
Your book ends with sort of a sad tale of Mike Wallace. Talk about what happened to Mike in the end.
Well, in many ways, it's part of the reason that I wrote the book, because here is the man, he probably influenced a lot of the work you've done over the years, Brian, too,
Sure.
and the direction of how you approach stories. And this is a man who was the correspondent of 60 Minutes. And at the end of days, he was in a Connecticut nursing home, and he didn't remember having worked on the show. His mind had gone. He didn't remember that he had grandkids. He didn't remember he worked on the show. And it was very, very sad to see how it all ended for him. The only thing he remembered was drop shotting me in tennis and watching me fall on my face and run into the net, chasing a ball. And that's the end, gave him great satisfaction. So it was incredibly like a full circle, because he hired me at the beginning for tennis. And in the end, the only thing he remembered about our time together was playing tennis with me.
And you end by talking about how the business has changed, for better or worse.
Well, it has. And, there was a certain value to storytelling and the art of storytelling. And, it's something Don taught me, which is tell me, Don's book, which he wrote about himself, was Tell Me a Story. And I think TV has gotten away from that. And certainly investigations. A lot of times the investigations I see on TV, reporters are very into a recitation of facts without thinking about the fact of trying to create an emotional punch so that the viewer gets emotionally involved in the outrage of what you're trying to do. Facts by themselves are not going to create outrage, because people get kind of numb to a recitation of facts and information. And so what I've done over the years is shorten the number of facts, but build to a punchline. And I learned that, strangely enough, from working in the Catskill hotels. And I used to do the lights for the comedians up there. So take, for example, Henny Youngman, Take My Wife, Please, right? That joke is all of 4 words, but it has a beginning, middle, and end. It has subjects, it has motivation, it has a little bit of an emotional punch. Or I'm going to take my wife to a place she's never been before, the kitchen. So again, there's a lot that's revealed in a very short amount of time. So what I did was I learned from these guys, these amazing genius comedians, and I translated that into TV to create storytelling that gets person pissed off. That's what you want. And you've done it over the years. And you want your story to get people angry so that they pick up the phone or write a letter to their congressman, or if you're a congressman, put in some remedial piece of legislation that'll fix the issue or the problem, or get somebody fired who should be fired. And so that, I feel, has been lost over the years.
I think you're right. I worked for two of the masters, Rune Arledge. One of my
Sure.
first stories when I came to ABC, I remember him saying, too many facts, too many facts. And Reuben Frank, who invented the Huntley-Brinkley report and ran NBC News for years. And he said, you know, graphics were the worst thing that ever happened to TV news because now we're telling stories we have no business telling that aren't interesting.
Exactly
And
right.
I think exactly right. But you were a master of it, Ira. You really were. You found ways to tell stories that had the punch, and that's the whole point, I think.
It's as important as finding the information. Yes, I had a fantastic associate producer who would sit in a West Virginia courthouse for 2 weeks, going through files and documents and discovery material. But then I would get 100-page memos, and God bless him. But then I'd say, wait a second, on page 32, that's where this, and I learned this from Don. Don would look at a story and he'd say, throw out the last 5 minutes. That's where your story begins. That's who you want to begin your story. And that sort of is the genius of what Don Hewitt had. Jeff Fager was great at that too. Jeff took some of my, and I was a pretty good storyteller, but Jeff also would say, this is not the way you want to begin your piece. You want to begin your piece on the second character, not the first. And that's what a good editor does. And I feel a lot of that is lost. You talked about Rune. Rune was amazing at this stuff. I mean, you and I would sometimes sit in his office and watch him do his tricks. I remember once sitting with Rune, and Rune had a wall of TV screens, and he never looked at you. He'd be watching the TV screens and having conversation with you. And one time there was a shot. He also ran ABC Sports at the time for a period of time. He ran news and sports. And so there was a shot of a golfer making a long putt. And so you see the guy hitting a long putt, but you don't ever see the ball going into the hole. So immediately Rune picks up the phone, calls the producer and said, why didn't I see the ball go in the hole? He said, well, the guy made a 100-foot putt. It would have gone on too long. And Rune said, I don't care how long it goes on. I want to see the ball going in the hole. You have to show me the ball going in the hole. And this was like, just an idle moment in time in Rune's office. But I remember this, that those are the details he always focused on, that told the complete story, that gave you that a little emotional, like, oh my God. You don't have the oh my God if you don't see the ball going in the hole. Rune understood.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Right. In fact, one of our colleagues went to see Rune in his final days. He was dying of cancer, he's in the hospital. TV's were on. He's watching a golf tournament, and he's watching. And he turned to a guy and said, nice putt. That was one of the last things he said before he finally succumbed to his disease. Well, Ira, this is fascinating. I've got 100 more questions, but so do the members of the Sharon Library community. And Gretchen, let's get to some of the questions from our friends.
Sure, we have one here. What's your view of investigative reporting today at the national news networks? What media outlet or reporter do you think is doing a great job?
Well, I think the New York Times and Washington Post during the Trump administration broke some extraordinarily significant stories. And they had the resources and the time, and they really knocked it out of the park. What I'd like to see, I think they're giving the Biden administration too much of a pass. And I don't see the same aggressive approach that they took in the Trump administration that they're now taking in the Biden administration. For example, they decided to give Saudi Arabia a pass on the Khashoggi murder. And when Trump did that, he was roundly criticized for that. Biden, I think it was maybe a one-day story and people moved on. But that's a major story. And it was something that certainly the Democrats had made a big hay about when it happened, and reporters made a big hay about. But I think there's too much of giving this administration a pass on a lot of issues. I know there's supposedly, the honeymoon period. My view is the honeymoon period lasts as long as the honeymoon lasts, which is about a week, and then you go for it. So I think in the Trump world, it was the Times and the Post that really carried the day. And I'd like to see them do the same thing in this administration.
Ira, let me just follow up on that. You wrote about the inside of what goes on in the networks. You worked at two of them, the big ones. Are they politically biased? Is there a slant there?
No. I think a reporter will do a story wherever the reporter takes them. And one of the things that, and you know about me, and I had a lot of relationships with, Republicans and Republican senators and staffers. And I just did the great story. I didn't care. I mean, I'll go kill somebody or investigate somebody, and I don't even ask what party. I don't check at the door to see if they're a Democrat or Republican. I check the facts. And that's sort of the way I always approached it. And I think a lot of people at the, that's not to say, by the way, that nobody at the network has a bias. Certainly people do, but you park your bias at the door and you know what your bias is. Mike Wallace, for example, was offered the job of press secretary to Richard Nixon, which obviously meant he was a card-carrying Republican. But you wouldn't know it from the work that Mike did, because Mike would batter both sides of the aisle pretty hard.
I think that's true of many of the major anchors. I think I would defy anybody to know the politics of Charlie Gibson or even Peter Jennings, frankly.
Sure.
I think, I'm not going to reveal what I know, but you'd be surprised. Gretchen, is there another question? Yeah.
Yes, Jean asks, how do you handle the continuous and slanderous fake news onslaught?
Well, I don't have to handle it anymore. I kind of left. But I think that, fake news, people have to understand at the beginnings of that. And it was created at the very beginning with Trump and Steve Bannon, and they felt, and Bannon told me this, which is the way to discredit any negative stories that against Trump was just to label it as fake news. And it was very effective. I mean, historians years from now, if not today, are going to be studying how effective it really was, because anything that came out, all they have to say is it's fake news, it's fake news. It wasn't fake news, it was real news. But by him repeating it, it kind of got ingrained in the public that gave him a pass on everything. So I think people are now waking up to that realization. So I think the term, especially since Trump has left the scene, is being diminished quite a bit.
You spent a lot of time with Steve Bannon and you gave him quite a platform. Do you have regrets about that in any way?
Oh, no, it was, it was a very, very significant story because, again, what I'm about is letting people decide for themselves. And we gave him it was 2 parts on 60 Minutes with Charlie Rose asking the questions. Charlie ended up running the interview for 5 straight nights on his show back then. And it got people to understand the way they thought they were thinking and how they thought. At the time, one of the big issues was about monuments, how there was a big outrage to take down the monuments of Southern generals. And Steve said, listen, where does it end? Does it end with taking down the Washington Monument? Does it end with blowing up Mount Rushmore? I mean, you could find fault with each one of these people. I'm not saying I agree with that point of view, but it allowed the public to hear the point of view from a person who was involved in the decision making. So I don't regret that at all. I mean, I'm all about informing the public about the points of view and then let them decide on their own.
Gretchen, what else we have there?
We have a question about social media and how that has changed the way stories are told. Has it affected the time and resources that you have to investigate a story?
Well, I think social media is where is the most significant development over the last 10 years. First of all, since this book came out, I probably have done, 30 podcasts. And I love doing them because you could get into something like what we're doing tonight. You could get into something much more in depth. And if you do an interview, and I've done some TV interviews as well, they reduce your interviews to a soundbite or two. And people don't really understand the full context. And with social media, and I'm defining social media in a very broad sense, it allows people to get into something more in depth, to listen to a podcast or to listen to, or to read articles in their fullest. It also has given a new platform for a lot of people that previously didn't have platforms. I mean, for example, Brian works, on a terrific show that 10 years ago didn't exist, maybe 5 years ago didn't exist. And it's given new opportunities for people to sort of expand and hear more information. I'm all about providing the most information to the most people. And that's what social media is really doing.
Ira, though, is there a threat that everybody has their own little silo, their own little source of social media? And unlike the days when 60 Minutes was seen by 40 million people, everybody knew Monday morning what to talk about. That's no longer the case. He
No,
has
you're
his favorite one. And is that a problem for democracy?
Well, I don't know about the problem for democracy. I think the big problem is that, in journalism schools, before tonight I was on, I'm on the board of Stony Brook's journalism school, and they were very big into news literacy. And what it basically means is trying to teach students to read newspapers or watch TV shows in kind of an intelligent way where they're able to discern facts from fiction. And I think people need to know there's a difference between something appearing in the New York Times and somebody blogging in their pajamas, is the way John Miller, our old friend, used to call it, sitting in their bed, blogging in their pajamas and sending something out. That isn't necessarily true. So they need to decipher these things. And too much of the noise out there is that people are not deciphering enough the truth from the lies. And I think, and that's what happened a lot during the Trump administration. The bloggers took over, created a lot of narratives that were completely false, that were absurd. And then the president mimicked them, and then he would do it. So it did create, it wasn't so much a problem for democracy, it was a problem of the people at home being able to discern fact from fiction.
And yet we ended up with a good chunk of Americans thinking that the election was stolen by the Democrats,
Right.
or that they were abusing children in the basement of the pizza parlor in Washington.
Exactly right.
There's certainly an issue there. Gretchen, any more questions from our great friends in the Sharon Library?
Yes, there's so many fascinating stories in this book. Are there any that you couldn't put in the book for one reason or another?
Good question.
It is a good question. It's not so much that I couldn't put it in the book. It's like you end up remembering things. I was in so many, I've done probably close to 160-minute stories. And obviously you have to edit yourself. And there's a few that I said, geez, maybe I could have told that one, which I forgot about. There was maybe that, some people said, hey, maybe you got volume 2. That might be something. But the main thing that I try to convey is the hard work you need to do in order to do great stories and investigative stories. And that became kind of a filter for putting the stuff in. That doesn't mean that I didn't put in a kind of a fun story I did with Tom Brady or Kim Kardashian or hunt for the truffles in France and Italy. I took a breath and did a few of those. But, there were a lot that I unfortunately just didn't have room for.
And Ira, I always thought as a professional watching your stories and others in 60 Minutes, that the great skill is you watch and you think, that looks pretty easy. I had a couple interviews, but we know the amount of work that went in to get it pared down. So it just told a very cogent story. It flowed. There were no questions you had. You didn't understand anything. And you didn't feel stupid. Like, I don't know how to understand this.
Right. And one of the things I spent a lot of time on was crafting an interview, because if you do an interview properly and a correspondent does an interview properly, you have to, a lot of times when you're doing a story, you have to narrate, you do a Q&A and then you narrate. So if you do it right, the narration becomes part of your question, and it'll save you some time of covering up pictures or doing a stand-up. That if you structure your questions properly and say, oh, we're gonna have to get this information in the piece somehow, let's put it into a question. So that's something that I was very keen on with a lot of the correspondents I worked with.
And you can see it in the final product. Gretchen,
Yeah.
another question from our followers.
Yes, I was wondering, given the 24-hour news cycle and all the things competing for our attention, what do you think the future is for the sort of journalism that 60 Minutes represents, the long-term investigations?
Well, I think there's Frontline has been on for many years, and Frontline is a fantastic show. And the secret of what Rainey Aronson, who's running the show now, has done is figured out collaborations, because she knows that the money is limited and staffs are limited, but she has a great platform. So she's opened it up for collaborations with ProPublica and other places like that that do serious investigations. And I'd like to see networks get back to collaborations. When I was at ABC and working on investigations, I was a big doer of collaborations with ABC affiliates and with other institutions, newspapers. And I think TV has gotten away from that. And I'd like to see them get back into that, because it's a way of expanding the staff. And it's also a way of creating a more of a presence for your story. And my big fear is that people are going to get away from investigations because, in the words of a former ABC News president, it takes the most time, costs the most money, and gets us into the most trouble.
3 reasons not to do any more of it. Let me ask you finally here, as a news consumer, how do you get your news? And then 60 Minutes, is it what it once was?
So the first part of the question is, I spend the morning looking at news aggregator sites, from Drudge to Vox to others. So I kind of go through that. Then I look at the Times and the Post, and then, maybe some of the other ones. I skim them, but usually the news aggregator sites pretty much cover the gamut for me. It's interesting. I can't remember the last time I read a story that was in Time or Newsweek. Yet in the old days, those were the magazines you sort of grabbed as soon as the mail arrived. And that's kind of gone. And in terms of what 60 Minutes has done, I mean, it's a changed broadcast from when I began. Now, just because it changed doesn't mean it's a bad show. It's changed. When I was on 60 Minutes, there was the emphasis on telling great stories. Harry Reasoner doing the most expensive meal in the world, or Morley Safer on the Orient Express. And now what they're doing is they're doing crashes, they're doing topical stories. Certainly there's a lot of news out there in the world as we do it. But it's not doing the storytelling that it once did. Part of that is you don't have Harry Reasoner, and you don't have Morley Safer, and you don't have Mike Wallace. You could only work with the players that you have. And there are great correspondents on the show, don't get me wrong, but it's not telling the stories the way it used to. Whether that's a good or bad thing, that's up to the viewers. On a personal level, I kind of miss the old stuff that we used to do.
Yeah, I think we all do. Well, Ira Rosen, I want to thank you so much for being with us tonight. This is a fabulous book. I raced through it. It's not only fascinating, but Ira, you're a good writer.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And thanks for having me, everybody. I appreciate this.
You bet.
Thank
Gretchen?
you so much. Thank you, Brian. And thank you so much, Ira, for joining us. We all really appreciate it. It was a terrific discussion. Don't forget, I've got a copy here too. We have more copies at the library. So just email us or call me tomorrow at the library and we'll have a copy set aside for you. And we hope to see everyone again soon. We have a great lineup of events coming up in April and then some more later in May. So please check out our website and we hope to see you soon. Stay safe and well, everyone.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Brian. Thank
Good night.
you. Good night.